there is a renewed interest in the Constitution. And I think maybe the year 2011 we could say is going to be the year of the Constitution. I mean, look at it. Even Congress is reading the Constitution now. How amazing is that? And I can tell you as an elected official, the majority of our elected officials, I think Dan could attest to this, have probably never read the entire Constitution. And if they have, it was back when they were in high school or they were in college. Now, some will cite snippets out of the Constitution, and it's what I call a soundbite understanding of the Constitution. That's about the depth that most of our elected officials, and as I'm learning, a lot of our Tea Party activists as well, only have what we call a soundbite understanding of the Constitution. Now, they're all meaning well, but a lot of times they're just repeating what they may have heard someone else say that the Constitution says or it means. And so one of the things that I have been led to do is to re-educate or reintroduce Americans to their true heritage. Now, the heritage is beyond just the history. It's beyond just the words and the phrases or the dates. It is what is the character, what was the intent, what were the ideals and the philosophy of the Founding Fathers as they wrote this document, or they derived this document called the Constitution. And to understand heritage, you have to understand what they believed, what their philosophy was. And heritage is extremely important. We have gotten away from this idea of a constitutional republic. I speak in a lot of high schools, and I usually only get to speak once. I don't know why I usually don't get that return call. But they'll ask me to come and speak to a high school class, and quite often I'll just kind of prompt things with a little verbal test, and I'll say, what kind of government do we have? And to make it easy on the school children, I'll give them multiple choice. Are we a democracy? Are we a monarchy? Or we'll come up 2 or 3 and I'll say, are we a republican? 80 to 90% always say we're a democracy. Then I'll ask one of them, did anybody in here know the Pledge of Allegiance? And so, yeah, well, you recited, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic. I'm like, wait, hold on, you mean to the democracy? Well, no. I said, but you just said our government was a democracy, and now you're saying it's a republic. And this is the indoctrination that we have had in our education system over the years. Our Founding Fathers actually despised the idea of democracy because democracy led to mob rule. Democracy was the majority always rules, and the idea under a constitutional republic is there are certain guaranteed rights given by God that can never be infringed even by the government, even if the majority wants to infringe those rights. So it's important that we understand. We also, our government officials today do not understand the Constitution, and quite often they're afraid of the Constitution. They're afraid not of it themselves, they're afraid of you knowing the Constitution. As Micah mentioned, I've taken on for the past several years some what you may consider controversial issues. I don't think they're controversial, but it seems like a lot of the other legislators do. And one of those was red light cameras. In my view, red light cameras were unconstitutional because they take a picture of the tag of your car, you get a citation in the mail, and you either pay the citation or you prove you were not the driver. Well, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says the government has a responsibility to prove your guilt. The burden of proof rests upon the government. And so that's been my premise of the red light cameras all the way through. Well, as I took on the argument on red light cameras, a newspaper up in Rome, which wasn't real friendly to me when I first got elected 7 years ago, had written several scathing articles about my ideals and principles and how extreme right-wing they were. And so they had to agree with me on the red light camera issue, but they wrote an article, an op-ed that said, oh, while we agree with him, we disagree with his premise. That he must have gotten a red light camera ticket at some time, or his family. That's the reason he'll be fighting it. But if he's serious about the constitutional issue, it will never fly. He needs to focus on the revenue. The cities and counties are just putting these red light cameras in for the revenue. And for the most part, I believe that was true, but yet I didn't take an oath of office to uphold a principle or idea of revenue. I took an oath of office to defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Georgia, and that had to be my predominant argument. So we persisted in making the constitutional argument. Well, I was on my way to a committee hearing, and I mean, we would pack the committee hearings out. My daughter was my legislative aide, and it would be her and I against about 400 people. Sheriffs, or mostly police chiefs, mayors, city councilmen, who were there to defend the red light cameras. And I was on the way to a meeting, and a high official within one of the departments of the state, it was the Department of Transportation, walked with me to the committee hearing. And he said to me, he said, you know, we're neutral on this red light camera issue. We don't care if they're there or not. In case some cases we'd rather them be gone because they increase congestion, they increase rear-end collisions. But will you do me a favor? Will you quit making the constitutional argument? Why? He said, because it's working. It's like, okay, that's a good thing, right? He said, no, because there's actually some other things we want to do with photo enforcement, and if you were to win this based on the constitutional argument, it will cause problems. The Constitution, to a lot of our government officials, is deemed as an obstacle. But you know what? It's supposed to be. That's the whole idea of the Constitution, is it's an obstacle for the government to limit its power and its authority. To truly understand this document of the Constitution, as I said, you've got to be able to understand the character, the ideals, the beliefs of our founding fathers. They left us with a document to where they actually outlined their entire philosophy of government, and it's the Declaration of Independence. If you really want to understand the Constitution, first you have to have an in-depth understanding of the Declaration. Now, the program that I've got here is actually designed to be a day-long 4-part series, and I'm trying to condense it down to, what'd you say I've got, Micah, 4 hours? Or an hour?
Well, today is a half day.
Okay. So we may jump through some things, we may try to move as fast as possible, and my family will tell you that, you know, once I get going, it's hard for me to stay on track. In fact, I should have brought my phone. Let me know when we're getting close to time. Somebody is. And I talked a little bit about heritage. We are losing our nation because we have lost our heritage. I want to read you something that comes from. Let me say this: if you're offended by God, you may want to leave now. Okay, because I'm going to lay out that when you separate God from our government, then you separated the entire premise of freedom and liberty. You can't do it. That's one of the reasons that we're in the situation that we're in today, because we've tried to separate God from the foundations of our government. And because our founding fathers built this entire nation upon the idea that there is a sovereign God and He is the giver of rights, when we separate God, we lose our rights. The book of Hosea, chapter 4, verse 8 says, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because they have rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee." Because we have gotten away from true knowledge, which is learning of truth, we will be destroyed because we don't know, we don't understand. Karl Marx made a statement when they were discussing how could you do world domination with communism, because for communism to ever have a chance of working, it needed the world domination. That's why we had the Cold War fighting the Soviet Union. And they were specifically talking about the United States of America because of how strong we were. How will you ever get the United States of America to accept the idea of socialism or communism? Marx said, take away the heritage of the people, and they're easily persuaded. So when we lose the heritage, when we lose that common bond, that tie, we're going to be persuaded. Now, I'll tell you a brief story, because I want to set the stage of really where we are today. In 2003, I was invited to go to the nation of Ukraine. And what's interesting, the nation of Ukraine, former Soviet state, had found new religious freedoms. They had, through glasnost and perestroika and the fall of the Soviet Union, they were now modeling themselves after the West. And churches were being rebuilt, and I was on the board of directors for a ministry that was working in Ukraine. Well, one of the Bible colleges wanted me to come and speak on the history of America. And they invited me to come on Thanksgiving Day, and I spoke at a Bible college, which was in the town of Kherson, Ukraine, which was literally just about 6 blocks away from the former Soviet Naval Academy. Now, I worked in the intelligence community when I was in the Air Force, so I had to actually get clearance from the Secretary of State's office in Washington before I could go. But it was really meaningful for me to be standing in this former enemy state, and we used to spend a lot of my work was spying on this state, that now I'm standing there teaching the history of the United States of America. After I spoke to the Bible college, I went out to dinner with some government officials there, and as we're sitting around the table, one of the officials started asking me a lot of questions about the history of America. It's very detailed, and I was impressed with the knowledge that he did have. And I was intrigued, so I finally asked him, I said, I'm pleasantly surprised at your interest here, but why do you have such an interest in the history of America? He said, because we want to become what you were. And I paused for a minute and said, what we were, not what we are. They want to become what we were. And I asked him about that, and he said, because while we are becoming what you were, you are becoming what we were, referring to the Soviet state.
Yeah.
I didn't disagree with it, but I asked him, could you give me a little more detail? He said, and I had learned a little bit about the history of Ukraine while I was there. He said, Ukraine was a Christian nation. We had a lot of the ideas and philosophies and freedoms the United States of America has, but when the Soviet Union came to power, we were concerned that we would be losing these. They said, don't worry about it. The Soviet Union is a religiously neutral government. We just don't acknowledge God. We don't care if you do. He said, well, but a few months they started removing the Christian monuments. They started destroying the state monuments that to the Christian leaders. Now the state has rebuilt a lot of these monuments. In fact, they took me to a church, St. Andrew's Cathedral, that a Russian Orthodox or Ukrainian Orthodox church, that the Soviet Union actually imploded. This church, it was built in the 1100s because it was next door to the Communist Party headquarters, and they felt that having a church there would give people the idea that God was superior to the Soviet state. And so they actually imploded this historic church. Now, since the state of Ukraine has rebuilt it. But he said, then they went further after destroying and removing our historic monuments, our Christian monuments. They started taking over some of our private industries. The government took over the banks and financial institutions. He said, then they started banning some of our documents. They took away our freedom of speech. We were very careful of what we said. You could be arrested by the KGB at any time. There was no freedom of speech. And now certain documents were banned. Some of those documents were banned. Of course, we've all heard that the Bible was banned, and it was. I've got a good friend who's still over there. He said, during the Soviet time, you didn't want to be caught with the Bible unless it was at one of the few churches that they left where tourists would come. Our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States were two of the documents that were banned during the time of the Soviet Union. Now, let's ask a question. Are we becoming what they were? Everybody's familiar with this picture, right? Judge Roy Moore in 2003 with the Ten Commandments being removed from the Supreme Court in the state of Alabama. Now, what's interesting about this was this had just happened not long before, just a couple of months before I went to Ukraine, and he referenced this as an example. Now, what does our founding fathers think about this? Let's take a look at a statement that George Washington made in 1779. You can see at the top there. You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Now look at this. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention. I don't think our founding fathers' total intention was this idea of total separation of church and state. Okay. Let's look at something that's really revealing. It's actually the appellate court decision that came down in the Judge Roy Moore case. If you look at the section 5, the statement that was made says, which is that government may not promote or affiliate itself with any religious doctrine or organization. If you want to interpret that into layman's terms, it basically says the government of the United States is religiously neutral. The same language that was used in the Soviet Union is taking over the nation of Ukraine. Is there anything else that's indicating we may be becoming what they were? Okay, go ahead.